So in the discussion that will now follow, and I'm very grateful that Giles Davies from Conservation Capital and Delphine, who used to be the CEO before me here at the Long Run for many years, have been very kind and agreed to join us for this chat, because we wanted to speak and share this with you, because for many years, obviously, the Long Run, we are always talking about, we want a balance when it comes to sustainability. We want people to accelerate. It's not just about environmental management. When it comes to sustainability and conservation, it needs to have a balance across all of it, between conservation, community, culture, and commerce. And over the last 16 years since the Long Run has started, we have also learned a lot about how hard it sometimes can be to balance these things, especially as the key thing for us, obviously, we don't want to create islands of best practice. We want our members to accelerate. We want them to protect the ecosystems they're part of, to engage with the communities that they're surrounded by, to really drive change. But obviously, that is not an easy vision for a single property or a single member, but also for us as a community as a whole. So Giles and Delphine and myself have been working a lot together over the last 6 months, trying to unlock this conundrum of how do we accelerate change from two different angles. The first one is looking really at, and I've started a little bit with Willie this morning, to look at succession. How can we protect the legacy to make sure that these incredible places around the world are protected in perpetuity? But secondly, also, how can we accelerate funding going to these properties and to the players who are at the forefront of conservation and on the ground to accelerate the impact? So first, thank you both so much for joining me and giving me the time and also all of your energy and your brains over the last few months to learn from both of you, but also learn from our communities as to where we are at and where do we see that potential. So what I would love to begin with, Delphine, because, you've been part of the Long Run also for a long time, again, looking at, the 4Cs and the balance. We've always seen that tension a little bit between trying to manage it all, between the here and now and where do you want to go. I would love to hear a little bit more about from you as to how you've perceived it, and actually in the research we've been doing recently, it's like, why is it so important to manage that tension? What are the opportunities by us being able to manage that tension?
Thank you, Anne. Lovely to be here and see everyone. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, as you say, the balance is hard to get. It's hard. And I think the impact show is about the trenches, right? I think getting the balance is really digging deep. For me, what I've seen over the years is how people have increasingly navigated the tensions. So, I think that one of the first discussion we had was, what are the trade-offs between the 4Cs? Actually, I don't think we can talk about trade-off, but more tensions. And one of them is short-term versus long-term. So we have these long-term aspirations as an organization, as a movement, as properties. But the daily grind gets in the way. Daily demands of running a business that's not necessarily fully mature, that sometimes gets in the way, and it makes it difficult for businesses to look at, what's the best decision at this time, and step back. The other tension that I feel often happens is, everybody on this platform understands that succeeding in our ambitions as a property or as an accommodation member or as the Long Run is not only about the property, it's about what happens at the landscape, as you mentioned. And again, that requires a lot of headspace. It requires a lot of vision. Navigating this tension again between the priorities of the business, the urgency of regeneration inside, but with engaging with the communities outside, and how do you engage and to what level do you engage and who do you engage with? It takes a lot of time and effort and passion, and it's a lot of going forward and a lot of going backwards. And this I think a network like this, a network like the Long Run, provides that peer support and morale. I can see how much this has been of value to the members. And then a third tension that I've seen is what, the perceived business imperative versus the ethos, aligning with the ethos. So there's a perception of what the guest want. What are we going to, the guest is priority. What are we going to deliver to the guest? But sometimes it doesn't align with the ethos. And what I've seen is that as members mature and as members evolve in their balancing the 4Cs, that starts to be reshaped, giving confidence to the team to guide what guest wants in alignment with the ethos. And what I believe has been transformational for a lot of our members, so I'm really focusing on members here, is having a clear purpose, a clear strategy, a 4C plan, a sustainability plan, however we call it now, articulating the impact, the aspiration, the impact aspiration has been a great relief for a lot of members to make decisions that are aligned with the ethos, give the team the confidence to say no to some things or guide, in a nice way. And for screening decisions, it's hard. It's like, you constantly have to make decisions, firefight, and keep that long term in mind. If you have a good strategy, if you have, that it evolves obviously with your work, it gives great relief. And then the third point, I think it's that step by step. I think people can be overwhelmed at the beginning of the journey. There's too many balls to juggle. But actually breaking it down to, the big wins, the, short-term step, phased approach is a really powerful way to kind of being able to step back. And finally, the journey's messy. So I think it's embracing that messiness and having a clear view of where you want to go. So that's my
Thank you so much, Delphine. And to be honest, I can only resonate the same thing. I think having that clarity of vision, and no matter what happens, and we all run a million miles an hour. And I feel like, if we don't have that clarity of vision, I can see that even for the long run itself, it's like you can get sidetracked so easy because there's constant demand on it, for your time, for your attention. And to be honest, for some of the members that have that clarity of vision very much, or properties or any business, to be honest, I have really seen over the past 15 years is like how they have accelerated because they have the clarity of vision, even if that vision has changed. But it has made a huge difference for those because you still know exactly what you can stay true to your course. And that made a big, big difference. Giles, can I bring you in and just, again, over the last 6 months, we've talked a lot about, wanting to now accelerate impact. How do we help members, accelerating their efforts on a landscape level to make sure we are working and collaborating with neighboring landowners, communities, national parks, or whoever's there, because ultimately it's this landscape approach that is so important, we think. Can I just ask from your perspective, and Conservation Capital has so much of a wealth of experience when it comes to nature finance. Why do you think tourism is so well placed to kind of address this crisis and opportunity that nature finance now provides?
Yeah, no, thanks, Anne, and thanks, Delphine, as well. Thanks for having me. I guess that it is important to frame this within the context of it's a conundrum that we're all living in at the moment, which is, mathematical stroke financial. And that'll set the scene. I mean, according to my alma mater, Price Waterhouse, more than 55% of global GDP is now either highly or moderately reliant on nature. And that means that nature, it's an asset that we all use for a variety of sort of non-hard purposes, but at the end of the day, from a hard perspective, it's I would say that outside human capital, it's probably the most important capital asset on the planet now, from a purely economic standpoint. The problem is that I heard Rosie mention the planetary boundaries earlier, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. If you take those as a measure of the health of nature, it's rather sobering. As I understand it, the Stockholm Resilience Centre started, mapping these in 2003. There are 9 of these dynamics which are, upon which the survival of Earth depends. 3 of them have crossed a critical boundary. If you roll forward to 2025, 7 out of 9 have crossed a critical boundary. So you have this incredibly valuable asset, but it's depreciating at a rapid rate, and that's going to have long-term consequences for many things, but business in particular, which I think is being largely overlooked. And normally what you have, and just to use an analogy, if you have an asset upon which you rely economically, call it a Land Rover with a safari guide, you reinvest in it. But that's not happening either. And so this is a third of 4 pillars in this conundrum. The nature financing gap is close to $1 trillion a year now. And that's a sobering number. And it's growing. It's growing in the period that many of our businesses and people in this group will have enjoyed spectacular growth since COVID. That gap has grown by $120 billion a year. But it's not to do with lack of money. There are many measures of this, but if you look at institutional investment grade assets, there are about $270 trillion worth in the world, and we only need 1. So that's equivalent to putting less than 1/3% of your revenue into your Land Rover, but it's not happening. And I actually think, so the point I'm making is that I think that one of the convictions we have is that it's not so much lack of capital for nature. And I think, we live in a world where there's growing awareness about this. So I think the markets, for want of a horrible word, are increasingly looking for ways to invest in nature, but they don't have product. And so that's one of the things we're looking at, is how do you develop product? But more importantly than that, and this is something that everyone overlooks, the real blockage is what we call counterparty capacity. If you're going to move money, it has to move from A to B. So the question is, if you raise money for nature, who are you going to give it to? And this comes to the answer to your question, is that there's a real dearth of counterparty capacity to absorb incremental nature finance. But of all the industries in the world, there are many, coming back to the point, that are reliant on nature. But what more intuitive one could you get than a sector whose entire business is premised on being able to show their customers nature in its various forms? And that's really the answer to your question. I can think of no more intuitive or powerful sector than the nature tourism sector, which is really, I imagine is effectively what your entire membership is based on, to be at the other end of these future transactions. So I think it's really important to start working on how we can create that capacity in these businesses to be a strong absorber of this sort of latent capital that I think exists but is not flowing at the moment. And then, of course, that's the basis of the work we've been doing on you, is to start to look at what's needed at the other end of the transaction in terms of that capacity in tourism businesses to be able to absorb that incremental flow. And it's been very, very exciting doing that work with you in the last 3 or 4 months.
Thank you so much, Giles. And yes, to be honest, it has been hugely interesting, because even for us who have worked with some of our members for so many years, I think we've all learned a lot about our members that we may have guessed on, well, we knew, but we didn't know to the extent in which we really have looked into. And I think is understanding all of the different dynamics that you have been looking at with us, I think has been really interesting. And I get back to that in a second. Delphine, can I just ask, 2 of the many things that also, like Giles, we've been looking at is this importance of the business progression to accelerate. We need to be ready, and many people are not ready to accelerate. So I'm just wondering, again, looking at some of the works we've been doing, is like, well, what do we need from like a governance perspective? From how do we set up the ownership structure, as well as like the succession business progression deal? Why is that so important as one of the pillars to make sure what Giles said is like getting these projects, making sure we have the capacity in-house to then accelerate our impact?
Well, I think, finance is a huge piece. I think that obviously we're in it for the long run. We're in it for the long term. We've heard incredibly powerful stories just the whole morning. But the question is, how long are they going to last? Right? We want them to last. As the long run, we talk about perpetuity, but as a owner, I'm sure that your vision is beyond you, right? And actually, when we were talking about succession, I realized how personal this is to me, succession, because I've seen my grandfather's business just go downhill tremendously for lack of wanting to let go. And it was a tremendously successful business. I've seen an organization that was very dear to me that collapsed by lack of looking for the right leadership. And I'm really proud to say that the next succession, like in the long run, we've taken our time, and I'm, thrilled to see how the long run is thriving. And this is succession planning, correct? It's progression. So there's three aspects in succession. There's leadership, there's management, it's transition, right? It's leadership, management, ownership. Three big aspects. And the stark reality is that, looking when we were doing that study, looking at the statistics, there's only 30% of businesses, small, medium businesses that make it, that make a successful succession. This is frightening. And when we looked into our membership, it was quite surprising to hear, to see that 40% of our accommodation members sampled hadn't thought about succession or were just considering it. 57% are not prepared if a key decision maker leaves suddenly. And this was the same with our travel businesses, except a bit more hadn't thought about succession. I found this very surprising. But then again, thinking about what Willie was saying, we have very passionate, the projects are driven with very passionate, very passionate people. Because to achieve what our members are achieving, you need passion, you need persistence, you need that extra than just being business savvy and a conservationist. However, so that emotion tied into the purpose-driven business and the family business is a great strength, but it's also a challenge. And what my reflection from the study is that there's this fear of bringing succession on the table because fear of conflict, the worry about letting go. The worry of burdening the next generation, not being sure what kind of leadership, would suit. Reality is succession is not a one-off event. It's what we do every day builds a good foundation for successful transition. So embedding our values, giving confidence to the team, protecting our ethos through, again, articulating our vision, putting, caveats in our governance, in our constitution, caveats on the land that we're using. There's a plethora of tools, but it's protecting that ethos to the core of the organization is one of them. Continuously looking at leadership, building management skills, building leadership skills is the other part. Ownership is a bit of a much trickier one because it's a bit more like a one-off event and selling or transitioning to the right owner. But bottom line, what I see is having the discussion early, putting this on the table, clarifying what the 100-year vision, and I think bringing back the conversation to this is about the future we've dreamt of, about. This is not about me. It's not about us. It's about us collectively working towards the future that we want. So getting back, basically, it's strategic planning for 150 years. It's no rocket science, but the avoidance, the silence, I think, is the biggest risk. Because if we don't know what the challenge is, we can't plan for it to continue that impact. So that's my insight. This is not necessarily, total answer to your question because I'm not a succession specialist. But I think what I've seen is really, that are the reflections from my experience and from our survey.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Delphine. And Again, there's so much more we can share about this. I'm just wondering, very conscious of time. Giles, in addition to what Delphine has shared, because these are some of the dynamics that obviously for conservation finance or nature finance, these are also important. But what are some of the other aspects that you also think are the key highlights that businesses need to think about and need to address in order to be ready or to really make sure they are a strong business that could then accelerate?
No, sure. But as a segue from what
Yes.
Delphine was talking about, obviously this organization is called the Long Run. It's particularly appropriate when it comes to the idea of nature finance. I'm afraid that there are very few quick wins in solving the nature challenges that we have. So any solution, be it finance or otherwise, is going to have to be long term. And then, of course, that draws out the pertinence of what Delphine's been talking about. Because if you're going to use nature tourism businesses as a repository for this finance, and I think they're very well placed inherently to do so, if you're going to raise the money, you're going to have to answer the question, are you going to be around in 10, 20, 30 years' time? Because these financing solutions could be that long. The other point, which is interesting in this regard, is that in the 22 years that we've been working around nature finance, we've done quite a lot of assessment about what we think has worked and what hasn't. And there's one striking common denominator in all the successes we've had, and that is that we've always been working with a counterparty at the other end who had a very strong vested interest in the landscape. And so the idea of just moving a nature financing foundation from one manager to another, it's okay, but it's not as good as working with people, and it's ultimately about people who, every aspect of their lives is tied up in one way or another, reputationally, financially, emotionally, with the success or failure of the landscape in which they learn. And that adds a complexity to succession, because you need to maintain that. You not need to maintain longevity, but you need to maintain that vested dynamic because it's with the financiers eventually are going to sniff that out ultimately. But yes, that's only one part. I mean, listen, we've developed over 22 years of some failures, by the way, and a lot of lessons, but also some successes. This thing called the nature financing activation process. What we're working with you on is just the front end. Before you even think about what type of financing mechanisms you're going to work on, you need to create this capacity at a counterparty level. And broadly, they divide into four headings. The first are sort of nature-related ones. So we've been looking in the context of your membership base at the landscape in which they operate and their relevance to the sort of nature agenda. We've been looking at tenurial dynamics around that with respect to your members. Do they have the rights to be in these landscapes and to be a stakeholder, and for how long? We've been looking at the extent to which they have a vision around their wider role beyond, and this was mentioned in your tension stuff earlier on, beyond, first and foremost, running a fantastic tourism experience, but also playing their role in nature and its conservation, and the kind of strategic clarity and KPIs around that, so that measurement can be brought to bear. So we've looked at those dynamics. The second one, the governance ones, and this is where there's been a lot of cross-pollination, Delphine, with what you've been doing. So governance and ownership. We look very carefully at executive management and the extent to which incentives exist to build in nature agendas alongside making sure that guests are having a wonderful time. And then crucially, we've looked at something which tends to be truly appalling in the nature world, and that's the extent to which these businesses appraise and respond and manage risk. And then there's a bunch of much more pouring financial dynamics around the stability of the business financially, the extent to which revenue is captured and recycled in a circular way into that natural context, whether or not there's experience with dealing with external finance and partners. And then the final bit is around stakeholders more widely, and local community integration in particular. These are all things that a sophisticated financier are going to ask detailed questions about before they commit a check into whatever mechanism, we haven't got there yet, exists. And what we've found within your membership base, and I suspect this is a proxy for the wider nature tourism space, is a high degree of variability across these. So within each dynamic, You have some very strong performers and some less strong performers. And then across those dynamics, there's some dynamics which are really, really strongly represented, and others that are less so. And of course, that creates a wonderful opportunity because the good practices are there. And within something like the long run, it creates a great basis to be able to cross-pollinate them. And that's going to be part of the next phase as we start to think more about, okay, the capacity is there, but what actually mechanism are you going to use to attract this finance? So it's a start of a journey, but it's been great so far.
Yeah, it definitely is a journey also for us. And to be honest, I think, it is great to see that, we always talked about the diversity of our members, but looking through these both lenses of the surveys, I think we've really realized how diverse our membership is between size, scale, where in the journey they're at. There's so many different things, but personally, I find it really exciting because diversity is really what will help us, because then we can learn from each other. We can inspire those who are early on, and we can also help each other on the way. And that's the whole point. I know I need to wrap up. So my one question for both of you at the end, I really would like to think about 10 years ahead from now. So in 2026, what do you think we will, as an industry or as a business, what will we regret acting on if we didn't act on in 2026? What's the one thing that we need to focus on now? Otherwise, it's going to be too late. Delphine, you want to go?
Do you want to let me go?
Obviously.
For me, actually, it's taking, resonating with what you said. And for me, it's less ego, more collaboration. I think we need to really strengthen, go all out on working together, but concretely working together to have the scale, the innovation, the power. And I also feel that we have to put all we have on the table. And for here, I'm talking about head, heart, body. We have to put it all on the table. Otherwise, we're never going to get there. That's my feeling.
Thank you, Delphine. Giles?
Yeah, I've got I think, a really clear answer to this. I happen actually in Delphine, I'm working with Delphine on this at the moment, where obviously in the context of this geography, we're both in Kenya here. We're doing a piece of work, and we built some, my first forays into working with people much cleverer than me on building AI models. But we're looking at the next 20 years. What are all the trends around some of the projects that we work on here, including your members? And we've identified 28 different dynamics which are likely to affect our future in terms of stewards of natural resources and operators of tourism businesses working off them. And there's one very, very, very powerful message that's coming out of that is that we will not be able to effectively look after our little bailiwicks in which we currently operate, whether it's 100,000 acres or 10 acres alone. You will have to integrate that future with your neighbours and other stakeholders, because the natural systems upon which the elephant or the tiger or the dolphin rely. You won't be able to control that by just doing really, really good things in the plot of land upon which you work. So difficult though it is, you said the word, Delphine, collaboration. Without that, we won't have a business in 10 years' time. But the opportunities for that are enormous. And so, some of this stuff is sobering. But I think, for every sobering statistic, there's a big opportunity behind it. And that's how people should think.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both so very much. And I am very glad that at least for us, collaboration has always been at the heart. So we will continue to try our best to, realize our potential to collaborate with others, because I agree. I think it's the key thing we need to do. So Giles and Delphine, thank you so very much for joining me today and for sharing a little bit more about what we've been working on behind the scenes. And there's more to come from us. And we will engage both the community, but also the industry and some of the things that have been coming out so we can inspire others. Thanks once again, and speak real soon.